Okay, I'm Chris Brooks. Thanks for coming to this panel. So this panel is about educational discourse, and I've got 4 great panelists. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves and their work. And so the rough structure is I'm going to add a few framing thoughts about educational discourse and some of the trends that are happening right now in the world of computing that are, well, and not just computing, they're really socio-technical trends in the intersection of computing and society that are changing our ability or impacting our ability in interesting ways to do educational discourse research. And then I'll turn it over to Aman, who will give a demonstration of an educational discourse tool that's a little bit different than your traditional classroom discussion forums, and then the other panelists to talk about methods, techniques, and approaches for this, and then we'll have some general questions. So a lot of the innovations, the trends, the things that are happening right now are not under our control in our classrooms. And one could argue we've never had good control over our classrooms, but our classrooms having such a technical component now to them, where hybrid learning and blended learning is the norm, students are starting to use a lot of ICT technology for discussion that the institution isn't a part of, that often the faculty member isn't a part of. And I'll talk about a couple of those. One example might be Piazza. So an institution doesn't have to have any kind of contract with Piazza in order to have a faculty member grab that and embed it in their course. And then where is that data, and who's controlling that experience, and who's scaffolding that experience, and who can do research on that? That's one example. Another example might be Yik Yak. Now, this actually service went under about 6 months, maybe 8 months ago, but it was a social network, Twitter-like, but anonymous, and it was focused on college campuses. And nobody was in charge of it. It seemed just the company. And there was lots of interesting discourse aspects to it, where people could post messages, people could rate messages. When messages got rated a certain way, they would disappear. There was lots of the same kind of issues we see on Twitter happening on this platform. And yet our ability to understand this discourse and engage with students and learning in this discourse was hampered by our ability to get access to the data. I think pervasive sensing technologies and the change we've seen in the last decade in the availability of low-cost pervasive sensing technologies is both a challenge and an opportunity. So everybody who's got a phone on them has at least one microphone and probably 2 cameras, and then we've got 40 people in the room. So that's a lot of sensing technologies. But if you've got one of the new iPhones or one of the new Samsung phones, you also have depth sensors, and that can tell you things about gestures and people's perspective, what they're paying attention to, gaze at a coarse grain level, not at the eye tracking level yet that Christina was talking about, but at least a head movement gaze. And so what could this do for us? Imagine if we were having a small round table discussion, and there was an echo dot in the middle, and it's picking up who's talking it and what they're talking about, and translating that in real time. Imagine that there was a Kinect-like camera or LiDAR, which is a laser radar essentially, sitting there, and it's picking up people's body language and the positionality of their body when they lean back, when they cross arms. What could we as researchers do with that to understand discourse, educational discourse, and educational processes? So I think that there's opportunities for us, and some of those opportunities are to build. We could build this new augmented classroom. Some are just to leverage that. If somebody else builds this classroom or these techniques, how are we going to leverage that? Do we have the methodologies, for instance, that we want, or do we have to pull these from different places? Understand and protect students in these classrooms as well. Are we ready for these data streams as a set of researchers, as a community? And if we don't build this, who's going to? And what power are we giving up as researchers and how do we protect that? As far as like energizing, let's say vendors, am I going to buy a smart augmented table from Steelcase and put it into my classroom? And if so, can I get the data streams out of that? Or is that Steelcase proprietary data streams now? I think another disruptor that's coming is really real-time access to data. And this is something that in the last 15 years has just exploded. There's, I think, some standardization efforts in particular, things like IMS Caliper or XAPI that are focusing on real-time data. But we also have all of these artifact translations, the CSCW technology that is very common now. Google Docs, for instance. It's very common for a classroom to just, you could break out into a shared collaborative writing activity and people just open Google Docs and start using it. And are we grabbing those data streams? Are we able to grab those data streams? Do we want to be able to? I think the temporality of this is an interesting aspect for our community in learning analytics. With discourse, there's lots of discourse research that is all done post hoc. And so are we ready for a shift into real-time discourse analysis? And of course, that's not to say that it's not being done, but I think it's going to become more and more pervasive. And then the last example that I'll throw out, and each of the panelists I'm sure has thoughts, but is changing contexts. So there's growth in the interest of new contexts for discourse. I'm going to point to MOOCs, which is a lot of my work, and the global classroom, and the kinds of perceptions people have as they come and interact with discourse. But I think active learning pedagogy is another example, where this kind of changing from the lecture format to discourse in the classroom. And not that we didn't have discourse in the classroom, but now we have the ability to capture some of that and respond to that in real time. And so what does that mean for us as educational discourse researchers? And I think that there's this interesting, and maybe this will be a footnote and maybe this will be a huge piece, but Twitter, emojis, and the rise of these micro-sized snippets of discourse. And I think it's interesting from so many perspectives. But I'll pick on emojis for a minute as one where there's been significant perceptual differences seen in populations based on the kind of phone they're using. Because a smiley emoji on one phone doesn't look like a smiley emoji on a different vendor's phone. And that's interesting, and people perceive those different smileys in different ways. There's also cultural aspects to it. People of different cultures perceive certain emojis in different ways. And I think that that's really interesting to think about as far as our discourse. So I'm going to turn it over to Aman, and Aman's going to come up and introduce a discourse tool, and then we'll discuss through the panel.
Hey, okay. I never use microphones, so am I too loud with this? I just tend to yell, but I'll try to. That's good. All right. I'm gonna hook this up here. So I'm going to invite you guys, those of you who are on devices, which I assume is most of you, to join me somewhere in a second here. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to this, though. So I'm a little intimidated to be here because I don't do anything with stats. I'm a philosopher. I'm by training and by inclination a humanist. However, I have a lot of interest in pedagogy and in public philosophy, and that's how I come into an interest in discourse. With that interest in mind, I've been working with a private company to develop a online tool that is the name of the tool is Kayalo, and which is the Esperanto word for reason, as an aside. This is a tool that somebody's been trying to develop in order to sort of model online, let's say respectful online discourse about difficult topics. And I've been working with him on how to use this in the classroom. Is this showing up there? It is. Look at that. So that's already amazing. So one of the questions that we had as we've been working on this is, how do you take a discussion and how do you sort of really highlight the nodes where critical thinking is taking place? And my reasons for thinking about this in terms of the classroom have to do with I've been trying to sort of figure out how to model in real time with my students a few different kinds of problems, right? So one is, how do you sort of just have a conversation in a more interesting way than a discussion board where you can sort of really pay attention to the inferential moves, but also how can you keep track of different parts of the discussion in different ways and show students, sort of some metacognitive things going on also. How do I keep track of, for example, instead of making a new move, a new reasoning move, how do I talk about or think about the best ways, the ways to sharpen the move that I've already made? Think of what moves are stronger than others. So that's a little bit abstract. If you guys are interested, let me jump you into here. We pulled up, I started a little thread of a conversation here, which as you can see is, should laptops be allowed in university classrooms? Now this is a discussion that we can have in real time. So if anyone wants to come into this, all you have to do, let me pull up here, I've got a tiny URL here. Yoinkity yoink, where's my mouse? I don't have a mouse. Do I have a mouse? Do you guys see my mouse? No. All right, let's see how I can. I've got a mouse over here. Does anyone know how to get my mouse onto that screen? This is a bad technical difficulty you have, right? But do we know? This is the technical guy here still? I can't get my mouse onto the other screen here. I'm in presentation. Oh, there we are. There we are. All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. The right, it turns out. Sorry, that's my mistake. All right, so there's my tiny URL. So if you go there, it's tinyurl.com YDY74GEX. That should take you to, what I'll do is I'll put this over here. It's going to ask you it might ask you to create an account, which will actually you can usually do with like Facebook or Twitter or what have you, but I'll put the tiny URL there. It's going to take you to this discussion here. So this is my little start of a stub of a tree here on this question, should laptops be allowed in the classroom? Now, we've started a stub here where we've got a couple of reasons for and reasons for against. My reasons for are listed here in green, and my reasons against are listed in orange. But of course I can thread down from there also, right? So now if I look here, so this is a reason against: laptops distract their user from the classroom lecture, which when I was in class was the point, right? No, I'm just kidding. Then I can have a pro for that reason, right? It makes them start multitasking, but I can also have some reasons against that there. And so to a certain degree, all I'm doing here, right, is creating a visually appealing but ultimately sort of a threaded discussion board, right, which all of you are invited to sort of join in real time. It's going to ask you, in order to avoid spam, you're going to have to ask for participation request, which you can do in one of two ways. You can just click on a pro or con, and it'll be a suggestion. Or if you open up this tab here, there will be a thing that says request participation, and I have a colleague who will add you straight in immediately. That's just to sort of avoid spam, right? And so we can start a conversation in real time. The idea here, right, is that as we're having that conversation, we're also being able to keep track of where we are in the conversation. In addition to having the conversation by having some pros and cons, look at that. Let's add that right in. Laptops are awesome. Look at that. Let's accept. Oh, nope. Yeah, and I'm going to also invite you as a writer. So now you can add in as many more as you want as you go. So if somebody else disagrees with defenders here, if I saw that username right, they can let them know why right there by clicking on cons. But in addition, if they think that perhaps laptops are awesome is a correct claim, but one that we could maybe formulate a little better, I could come in here to comments and I could say, hi. Is that defenders? Yeah, there we are. Can you explain a little more why they are what you mean by awesome? And so now defenders can go, if they want to, they can respond to me in that thing. They can also go back and edit the claim here, right, to make it a little bit sharper, a little better. And so we can have a discussion. In other words, we can have a discussion not just about do we agree that laptops are awesome, which I can have here in pros and cons, but also, am I making that particular claim as tight and as good as possible? I have a discussion-wide chat over here. Right? I'll abandon that. I have a discussion-wide chat over here that I can add in. Let's start accepting some of these as we go here, right? Hopefully other people will be too. so I can keep track of sort of discussion-wide issues over here. In addition, if I want to start to think about evaluations, I've also got sort of an impact thing here. So I can come in and I can vote, and I can say, wow, I think that this is a really great reason why laptops are great, so I'm going to give that a really high impact, or I think it's a really crappy reason, I'm going to give it a low impact. And in all these ways, then I can sort of keep track of these different things that are taking place. Why is that useful? I mean, well, hopefully we can all see why that's useful as a teacher. So let me talk a little about how I use this in the classroom. I've got about 4 minutes, is that right? So I've been using this in the classroom in a few different ways. I've been trying to use it to replace the discussion board, but in my job, I find in the stuff that I teach very writing heavy classes, and I find the tools for analyzing writing and targeting different parts of writing to be not as developed as more quantitative skills a lot of the time. I spend so much time with my students working on the following two things: how to put together a thesis statement, which will probably be on my gravestone and will probably be the thing that sent me to my grave, over and over again, right, for 20 years now. And also, then also with that, what claims succinctly support my thesis, right? I spend so much time on these very small parts of the writing process, which for which at least I haven't found, if any of you can tell me, it would be awesome, great tools yet to sort of automate, right? These are skills that, as far as I can tell, still take a lot of time, and a lot of times they're also sort of mixed in with a lot of other things that take place in the writing process. So one of the things that I've been really interested in using this tool for is to sort of atomize elements of, let's say, critical thinking. So for example, let me pull up here. I thought I'd already pulled it up, but I guess in the course of moving things around, I had unpulled it up here. Let's see there. Here we go. Some different sorts of assignments that I've done that I've put together to use this for. So straightforwardly, you can use this as a sort of, like we're doing here, a sort of a threaded discussion, right? And interactive debate. You can also, I've also been toying with using it to present content to students in the first place. So is this a way to visualize complex arguments that students can use? I'm teaching a graduate course right now in Kant's First Critique, which is, of books that there are, one of the harder ones, I think. At least it has been for me. And so I've been helping them sort of, instead of developing and debating new arguments, try to visualize the structure of different points in the book. Like, for example, why does Kant think that space is a property of the subject and not of the world, right? It's a tough argument to make, and we've been trying to see if visualizing in this way is helpful. Other things that I can do, though, that have been sort of interesting and I think fun for students. So one of the things, especially with introductory level students, that I struggle with, and I'll be done here in a minute, is to keep track of how different claims relate to one another. And so I've tried to develop a few different kinds of exercises that highlight that. So for example, I'll take a bunch of claims, I'll have them all unsorted, and I'll ask my students to sort of put them into their proper inferential structure. What looks like a final conclusion? What supports that, right? How can I put this together in terms of pros and cons to make sense of things? Can they find mistakes? Right? So have my students have an argument already put together and have my students go through and identify mistakes. Simply evaluate the argument and use the chat feature instead of making new arguments to talk about and evaluate arguments. So actually, one of my big emphases in a lot of these, it turns out, is to try to slow down discourse, right? I think that social media can move so fast and has a lot of the potential problems that Chris mentions. Is there a way in which we can use and leverage social media, however, to get them to really think more carefully about the moves that they're trying to make? That's something that I've been interested in. And anyway, I hope you guys enjoy messing around with the laptop discussion. I'll monitor it throughout the day. So if people are still sort of on there and messing around with it, or if you want to invite some of your colleagues who aren't in this session, feel free, and I'll sort of monitor it and we'll see where it goes. Thanks.
So thanks, Eamon. So one of the things I really like about Kylo is the opportunity to embed such discussions inside of something like an LMS. And LMSs right now are pretty depressing to me as far as how discourse takes place in them. And that's both the on-campus LMS and, frankly, the MOOC LMSs, where we have such a rich population, a global classroom that could be attacking some of these issues. And so I think that after seeing Kylo, I really started to think that diversity of educational discourse tools is something that's an opportunity in our future, and that we might be the kind of interesting community to help lead that, along with, of course, others in the learning sciences. I wanted to ask Andrew to introduce his work.
Hi, I'm Andrew Gibson. I'm from Queensland University of Technology. My work is in reflective writing analytics. For those of you that don't know what I mean by reflective writing, it's basically when people write about their own experiences about themselves. Commonly we might think of personal diaries or journals, but in an academic sense it's often used to reflect on particular experiences that are distinctly personal, like when students go on internships or practicums or those kinds of things. It's commonly used with teacher training, also in nursing and a bunch of other areas, but there's increasing interest in that sort of reflective writing space. And most of my work centres around trying to see whether we can bring insight to that process, but using computational tools to do it.
So you would largely use methods like NLP, computational NLP?
Yeah, I guess I'd describe the technical aspect of it as being more applied NLP. There's an extensive amount of computer science that goes into the actual low-level NLP work, and also linguistics. My work would tend to sit on top of that, so much more in the applied space.
And so I'm curious, there's been huge changes in some of the computational techniques in the last decade. Word2Vec, right, is now a mainstay of any paper, it seems, that has to do with text discourse.
Yep.
And I thought maybe you could share with us some of the opportunities that have come up in the last 5 years, or the ones that are emerging now that you see as potentially transformative for the kind of work that you're doing.
Sure. I guess just probably the biggest one, and I'm not sure that it's emerged. It certainly emerged as opportunities in the NLP space. I'm not sure whether it's come up into the applied space a lot yet. It's definitely there in certain areas, and what I mean by that is the big rise has been in probabilistic or statistical approaches to understanding language and using big data to create models of language. And a classic example of that in recent times is when Google changed their core NLP engine from one that was essentially rules-based to one that was neural network-based for machine translation with some common language groups with massive improvements. And that's probably been the big, machine translation's probably been the big area that's benefited. In my space, less so, but nevertheless, it's there. I had an experience last year where I spoke to a professor from University of Massachusetts Amherst at a machine learning conference about maintaining some of the natural language processing libraries that they'd been involved in creating. And he said that it was on hold, and many of the other software development at universities was on hold because of the effect of neural models of language, and they just weren't sure where it was going, and they didn't want to sort of invest time in software that potentially is going to be dead in 6 months' time. So there's big upheavals in that space. I don't think it's settled yet. I think there are opportunities in the probabilistic space of language that we can't get from sort of more traditional approaches to language, but there are also problems as well.
Now, I know in your work, and you and I have talked in the past about real-time architectures, and it seems to me that reflective writing is a place where some of these architectures could be realized and used. And so I'm curious, in the applied space, what kinds of tools do you think could be built, or opportunity spaces there are, given our ability to now do lots of things real time, including matching in big corpora to individual text people are using, or NLP in real time? Where do you think that there's some fruit in the applied field, kind of looking into the future?
Well, definitely, I think the temporal aspect of reflection is an important part of when people reflect. So being able to capture things in a timely way is significant. And if we're interested in bringing feedback into that process, like in an academic sense, we might be interested in giving them feedback on the quality of the construction of their reflections. In a personal reflective sense, we might be interested in giving them sort of support if they're anxious, or if there's distress in the sort of reflections they're doing, or encouragement, or matching them with like-minded people, those kinds of things. So being able to do that in real time is significant. And I think the way I'd kind of characterise it in terms of the research that I'm involved with at the moment, and other people that I know, a lot of us are trying to make the feedback loops involved in this process temporally smaller. So rather than doing things post hoc, we actually try and bring the analytics as close to possible to real time with the user. But then that raises other questions, like particularly in a learning context, like if you can deliver something in real time, should you? Like, is it going to benefit the learner?
Sure. So what's missing? What would be the one cool tool, method? What do you, if you could have a piece of data, any of these that would help amplify your research or give you something new to dig into? Could be a new sensing technique. World's your oyster. What would it be that you would be interested in?
So personally, I think what would most change the sort of work that I'm involved in would be anything that contributes to a better understanding of cognition and what's going on inside people's heads. The language tools have tended to be trapped in the language artifact itself. Often there's problems with context. The sensor technologies you're talking about, the sorts of things that Christina demonstrated with finding out user characteristics, those kinds of things, a lot of the sort of pervasive AI that's making its way into personal devices and phones, there's potentially the promise of just understanding how users are thinking, how they're going about a task, all of that sort of stuff much better. But at the moment, those kinds of advances are not well integrated with natural language processing tools, and I think there's promise there in the future.
Yeah, I think multimodal data is going to be huge, and really represents a new horizon for us in the field of learning analytics and education. And lots of people are starting to seize in on it, but I think that it's still very much in its infancy to be able to link multiple sensors together. So thank you for that insight. Sasha, would you like to introduce your work?
My name is Alexandra Poquet. Sasha is how people know me.
Sorry, too informal.
Okay, thank you. And I'm a postdoc at the National University of Singapore at the Institute for Applied Learning Sciences and Educational Technology. And my work is in communication networks. So my work is quite different from the work with the text directly, because I work more with the representations of the text, because I'm interested in facilitating interactions between the learners and having impact on the quality of the learning that they have through sort of social settings.
Yeah, so I think, so generally I think of social network analysis as one example of that. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the techniques that you apply?
Right. So I use common techniques that are now mainstream in social network analysis, which is basically networks are constructed from the text. We infer the relationship between the two learners, and then statistical models exist that work pretty well, coming from social science, and computer scientists advance those. But one of the things that I would like to talk about is the questions that I ask myself when I apply these common tools, and I think sometimes, especially when we apply network science to text, we forget to ask these questions. As many of you probably know, network analysis is an analysis of relations between entities. And the question that we often forget to ask is, what does that relation represent? So the common thing, we take the forum data. I've spent a lot of time working with MOOC forums where you have this overly complicated dynamics of who talks to whom. And normally if I look at somebody else's work and I say, what's your edge definition? People say, well, whoever talked to whom. Right, but how do you know that? I mean, how do you know that this person talked to that person? Does that mean that there is a semantic overlap between the text? Or does that mean that the posts occurred one after one another? What's the understanding of that relationship, even before we move it any further to the social domain? And another question that I learned to ask, and that has been pretty defining in the analysis that I do, is which kind of relationships are we omitting when we're defining those tasks? So the post-reply structure that many of us use, this person replied to that person, creates an edge, but then we are also omitting a whole bunch of other edges potentially to other people in the same conversation. And is that a consistent thing to do, conceptually speaking? Because the next step, and you will see, so there are some good literature reviews of how we do these kind of things with forum data, LMS, and all that, that argue that we have to have more statistical approaches. This is all wonderful, but we are basically going to aggravate the problem by running statistical models over our data that we don't know what it actually represents. So that's the issue that I wanted to highlight. What my work has been within MOOC domain, so I've been trying to understand the social context of MOOCs. I've argued that we do not have proper concepts that describe that space. I've spent a lot of time trying to dissect the different populations of learners to actually focus on the parts of discourse that make sense to me, and then construct normal, nothing special kind of networks on that, and run statistical analysis to show that there are commonalities across those networks. I replicated that kind of work in formal online courses as well to see whether the indicators that we observe at scale for what I would argue are effective communication networks coming from discourse differ across different settings. Today I'll be talking about the work that we've done at the University of Michigan, replicating this again on a different kind of courses. So there's nothing special about the methodology. I think the thinking that's, as you have pointed out, we have more and more technology that records all this fascinating kind of information. Who looked at whom, who sat next to whom, who said what, at which tone. But the bottom line is when you translate the data into the thinking and to the concept, you have to ask all that same question. What's the relationship between the two things? What does that relationship represent? What are we omitting? So, and what are we going to put the model over at the end of the day, even before we ask what it means?
Yeah, so I think that's a great insight, actually, because I've reviewed many social network analysis papers in the field of learning analytics, and often it is we create a conversation a network of people who are talking to one another, and does that mean that they're listening to one another, that they're reading those messages, that they're replying? The temporality of the data is one that I find often very interesting. So you take often a set of conversation threads and you create nodes and edges between them, but actually you don't know if the person who wrote the first message went and read any of the responses. And I think that often there's a lot of implication there. I'm curious as to your thoughts about the application space then, and in building tools that maybe restrict the learning process in order to clarify what the representations are that we're using. I'll give an example. So I was involved in a project about a decade ago at the University of Saskatchewan called iHelp, and it was a peer discussion forum tool. But we intentionally made it so that a person who wanted to read a message had to click the subject and read a message. And so it wasn't all one thread together. And that means we had read information, or at least intent to read. We knew what was being rendered, and so we could form network graphs that actually included reading and those relationships in there. I'm curious as to tools that you might have seen, or maybe even reflecting on Kylo here, which is similar, right? To read somebody's evidence, you have to click on a box and it renders, and how that might interplay with the methods that you use to understand discourse.
Right. So I think the exciting things that are happening, and I'll touch on a few themes you have noted, is that there are some people in the field who are thinking or trying to find better concepts to describe how we build networks out of discourse. And for instance, not my work, but Bodong Chen has been looking at how to represent interactions using edges that mean different things. Because maybe, I don't know how much you realize that, but normally the definition of an edge is very it's reductionist. We can't have too many, because otherwise we won't be able to apply methods to basically produce any kind of statistics out of the network analysis. So he's been trying to conceptualize what a network of learning would look like based on classical theories of learning. That's a big undertaking, and I'm really, really happy that there are people who are taking time to think through how we may represent things better before we actually produce tools and tell learners that they're in the center of a network that we don't know what it actually represents. And at the same time, what's happening in the space, in the social science space, is that there are a class of models that allow us to statistically evaluate network patterns. So I work with exponential random graph modeling quite a bit. Another class of models is relational event modeling. The differences are basically conceptual, besides the calculations, is whether the tie is an event or whether the tie is a state. So if I'm a friend of yours, that's a state, clearly. But if I'm talking to you, that's an event. So conceptually, these are two different things. So we would want to apply actually different kinds of models developed for these things. So what's happening within the space of the models is that it's moving towards allowing us to put more data in the network. So we can have multi-level networks. I think that's the fascinating development. So for instance, we're all people, we have relationship between one another, and then our institutions have a network between themselves, so that's two levels. And then we also have relationships to our institutions. So patterns, these three-level or three kind of ties that all come into the same network are now, can be quantified, but still on small scale. So things like that I think are promising. I'm looking forward to better ideas as to how to calculate things and how to represent things before we build better tools. I think that's where I'm on that.
Cool. So with my last question is the same one I had asked Andrew. One cool tool, piece of data, new method, and maybe that was the new method, but what is it that would be really energizing and would change your research significantly?
Asking better questions.
Better questions.
Yes, I think we're still, when it comes to network analysis, we're still in the research question phase. Let's rephrase that until we get it right.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Danielle.
Hi. I'm Danielle McNamara from Arizona State University. And I do research that revolves around, partially around creating tutoring technologies that are adaptive and responsive to natural language input from the user in driving the tutoring system in improving literacy. And one aspect of what I do has to do with natural language processing and building tools to provide researchers, educators, and students with more information based on natural language processing. And so we've built, for example, Cometrics in the beginning, which provides to us thousands of features of language. And then, of course, there's a public tool that provides a limited number that was based on research that we've done in order to kind of narrow down what I thought was the most informative features that were popping up in terms of predicting text difficulty. And so it is important to realize that Cometrics is a tool that is, its purpose is to provide information about, fundamentally about text difficulty and features of language. But it turns out that linguistic features and semantic features of language are enormously predictive across an enormous, across everything I've tried. It's extremely predictive and informative about cognition, literacy, language sophistication, collaboration, the evolution of discourse across contexts. We've done work that using reverse engineering from an essay to predict even working memory capacity. So we have done a lot of work on cognition, of course, because I'm a cognitive scientist. Fundamentally, we want to understand reading comprehension and writing. That's the two areas that I focus on most. But we've also done work in MOOCs in using language and discussion forums to predict completion with extremely high accuracy. We've done work in context of diabetes patients and their email messages to doctors in predicting literacy with, again, extremely high accuracy. We can predict who an author is. We can predict in the context of a math course, using linguistic features of their language, we can predict their performance in the math course, because math literacy is important. So there's, I couldn't possibly name all the contexts. One of where we've used NLP and linguistic features in and been highly predictive. One of the areas that we've done, it's work that I've been doing with Mihai Dascălu, is in work on collaboration. So for his dissertation, he created a methodology which I made him name Cohesion Network Analysis. And what that does is it defines the edge in terms of the semantic cohesion. And so that's very exciting and informative. We can also look at, in terms of dialogism, the evolution and essentially the flow of the discourse in a collaboration. We've done work in terms of visualizing that across many different types of contexts. So that's very exciting work. I'm excited to see that evolve. And he's just boundless in amount of energy. So it's exciting to work with him. And then Laura Allen in the back has been working more on dynamics and applying dynamics to discourse. So we're extracting, looking at the patterns in terms of the flow, but in a different way than just looking at the components. She talked about that, a little bit about that yesterday. So there are lots of exciting directions. One of the things that was mentioned is deep learning. I was pretty skeptical about that, and Word2Vec. And we've been doing a lot of work comparing, is deep learning better, is Word2Vec better, blah, blah, blah. And deep learning actually does work. And Word2Vec is informative too. Word2Vec is like, doesn't add that much to us, but so we are always using and comparing different tools, but one of the things that it always does come down to is when the tool is going to be used. So for example, we had a situation where Mihai was able to build a much bit more predictive tool for one of our tutoring systems, but we couldn't use it because it had a 5-second response time, and 5 seconds too long for a response time in a tutoring tool. So we had to kind of extract the main features from it. We couldn't use the machine learning algorithm, and then we had to kind of mimic it and rebuild it so that we could actually use it. And then, of course, we'll still have it for experimental purposes, and then eventually, you know, those kinds of tools will be able to use when we have more powerful computers. And in another situation, when we were predicting literacy and the responsiveness of doctors, we also considered, you know, when we're building a tool for that to give feedback to doctors, we're considering the parsimony of the algorithms. So for example, in one case, a deep learning algorithm was more accurate, but we chose SVM because it was quicker. So there are all sorts of tools, and they are extremely powerful. There is no aspect of language we cannot capture, period. That's it. We got them all. And so one of the problems now, or one of the tasks ahead of us, is narrowing it down and being able to do more convergent and divergent analyses to and automate that. So within the natural language processing tools, make it more apparent to people what is correlated with each other and what might be something that you should contrast. So we're looking forward to potentially building a tool called the Writing Assessment Tool, hopefully if we get funding. And that will be a tool that provides information to 3 users. It would be the teachers, the researchers, and the students in different formats. So we are, one of our goals, we've got many goals, but one of our goals would be to make more public and more available information about writing. And then, yeah, I'll end there.
Yeah, it's a fabulous portfolio of work that you guys have done at ASU. I'm curious as to your biggest pain point, and you had kind of mentioned computation in the real-time sense. So when you're trying to build a tutor, the real-time nature of it is incredibly important, and so computation kind of might be one of those. What's another big pain point for your research that you'd really love somebody else to go solve so that you could continue to do the things you do?
I'm stumped.
Okay. So it's quite a series of paths that are available right now. Like it's quite a fruitful field, you figure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just tell you what we are worse at than anything. Maybe I'll say that. Sure. This is not in our wheelhouse. We're constantly failing at visualization. So whenever I'm funded, I never get funded for the designer, for that's kind of like, they don't see that as necessary. And so I would say that our visualizations almost always suck. So yeah. That's one of them. Maybe Laura can think of anything else. What else are we terrible at?
This is on the spot with Laura Ellen, Mississippi.
What are we terrible at?
What are we bad at?
Yeah, what are we bad at, Laura?
I mean, there is a lot, but I feel on the spot. I think that we're getting better at it, but I think we're pretty bad at, we talk a lot about how other researchers leave language out of the picture when we do these different sorts of analyses, but then we kind of fall victim to the same problem a lot, where we are still not being very multimodal. So sometimes we'll bring in other modes, but the way that we combine them isn't very sophisticated, so we sort of are just like, oh, well, we'll do the language part, but we'll still keep it separate from everything else, and so we're not integrating that with a lot of other of the modalities that I think are really important for, I mean, even if you're thinking about language, like the power of all the other things, that all the other information around, surrounding that's useful, I think that's really important.
We've had a couple of projects on that where we were attempting to combine multiple aspects of performance within a MOOC as well as language, and then combining performance within the tutoring system, so behavior across time and language. And it's true that where we fall out is that it does become enormously complex. And I do find that in the end, the language is often just, it's so informative that I would probably turn to that first. It brings to mind an analysis that Scott Crosley did, where we were looking at MOOCs, and then we did the language, then we did the language plus the some of the behaviors, like whether or not they looked at assignments and some clicking behavior. And the combined model provided more information, but I do think that what we were doing is pretty rudimentary. I didn't have a feeling like, here's a thing. We're really stuck in linear models, and so I don't think any of this is linear. And so it was a linear model, and I'm sure that all of these things interact. And it's really hard to statistically build the models so that we can capture how X depends on Y and Y depends on X. So when, what it always comes down to is, yes, but the linear model works. It's like, yeah, okay, I know it's not linear, but in fact, we're capturing 80% of the, variance. So,
Right.
Right.
Oh, that's great. So I think we have 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Any questions? I'm sure at least Simon has a question. Well, it's about educational discourse.
Maybe we should ask a question. What do you guys want to see? What do you want done?
Sorry, if I could have my magical outcome, it would be a little Google Echo that you could stick on a table, which would transcribe the student discussion, recording the times and the overlaps. That would be just fantastic.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
And technically, that's very doable.
Yeah, well, who can we get to do it?
Right, okay.
Right. Google. And then they've got all your information. Yeah, we kind of left that out. Yeah, they do have everything, and they can tell everything about you.
Thank you for all the information. I'm new, so maybe this is a question which cannot be answered. But I'm looking at higher order skills on video, and then trying to feed back to the learner how to adjust their attitude or abilities or beliefs in order to better the group collaborative learning process. I was looking at multimodals to augment a self-observation scale process. And what kind of multimodals would you see the most lucrative in this perspective?
Anyone want to grab that?
Oh, good.
From my perspective, there's a lot of emerging technology in this space, and we're only kind of getting glimpses of it, so it's hard to sort of name specific tech now. But I think there's a general principle that's going on. We're managing to capture a lot more effective information than we have before. And I think that dimension of the learner is much more significant than we've given it credit for before. How the learner turns up and how they feel before they even start a task has a massive effect on their learning. But it's largely been opaque, and previously, with regards to sort of text analytics, we've relied on additional information like self-report type data to collect that, which has notorious problems with it. The fact that this sort of thing can be collected unobtrusively and kind of seamlessly in multiple sort of technical ways, I think shows a lot of promise. So I'd probably, in answer to your question, I'd probably look for those kinds of multimodal technologies that give me effect data. I'd probably, personally, I'd probably push towards unobtrusive technologies. So, for example, cameras in phones and, voice analysis, things that kind of can happen much more naturally in the course of a discourse, as opposed to something that intrudes upon the person, the learner.
And I would have answered language, of course. Yeah, capturing what they're saying and then doing essentially with multimodal analyses within the language, because we can look at sentiment in what they say. You can look at their language sophistication, prior knowledge, but you can also analyze their interactions. So applying social network analysis to the semantics of what they're saying. So there's a lot you can do with the language, and then I think the growing field is also looking at how to detect affect and attitude with other technologies. Yeah, exactly.
See, I primed Simon.
So language is very, very complex, multi-layered, full of many layers of meaning, etc. So machines are going to have a hard time with it when it comes to trying to discern whether there's really, good critical thinking going on or deep reflection going on. So how good does it have to be? How do we make decisions about how good it has to be before we put it in front of students? And is there scope for working with language technology even when it's not perfect, or will this lead to instant user rejection in your experience?
One of the issues, I guess you said something that I disagree with, and that was somehow you said we can't pick up critical thinking or deep learning, and I don't agree with that because we've done it. And my answer to the question really falls back to we do have to have benchmarks. And so you have to build your models based on some kind of benchmark, and usually that benchmark is human performance. And so one of the issues is the degree to which humans are reliable, like I match another human, and how much training it takes in order to achieve reliability, and how much validity you use across the training process. So how much you're changing the actual judgments that people will make. So there was I can't remember what situation that was being talked about, but there are some things that are harder to achieve reliability in. And it's very simple to predict which ones they will be. And that's the degree to which you're basing it on your prior knowledge. So if it's concrete and objective, then we will be reliable and we can build models. If a human is basing their decision, their judgment on the language that's in the behavior or on the behaviors themselves, we're going to build reliable models. That's just the way it is. But the degree to which the humans are building based on their own judgments, their own prior knowledge, then they're not accurate, and then our models lose some degree of accuracy. They're reliable, of course. And so in terms of some things, you can boil down some things very reliably, so which we've done, deep learning or active learning, critical thinking, creativity. We've built some very, very accurate models on creativity. So the question is, how accurate does it have to be before you put it into a system? And I think for me, that's always been somewhat of a judgment call, and based on adjacent accuracy as well as accuracy, precision. It has to be pretty darn accurate. We look for 90% adjacent accuracy on any kind of judgment. But that's just, I don't think that's really answering your question.
Okay.
What's...
That's a start, though. Yeah, I do believe we can detect critical thinking and reflection, but we're not going to get it right all the time.
But neither do humans.
Neither do
That's
humans.
what my point was.
Mm-hmm.
So you're creating a benchmark that doesn't exist in the world. And so we can do it, and it can match various humans, and other humans. When you get that feedback, you actually do judge it. The students in a Turing test judge it to be accurate, and when they don't judge it to be accurate, they are still informed by it. So just because we're not accurate doesn't mean it's not useful. And it also depends on what kind of feedback that you're giving. So I think what you're ignoring here is the enormous amount of work we put into feedback, and the quality of the feedback and the type of feedback. So for example, in my tutoring systems, I'm not giving a large amount of feedback like on whether they're, I avoid like spelling feedback. It's about what strategies they should use or can use to improve the quality of their writing or improve the quality of what they're explaining or comprehension. And so when you get into that area, the accuracy of the model actually becomes less important than the feedback itself and how that feedback is delivered. And
agree,
so,
yeah.
so that's kind of where we go to.
Okay, thanks. Well, if you'll join me in thanking the panelists. It's lunchtime now, and a reminder that there's the AGM. I believe it's in here.
There are specific box lunches. You can go and you can grab a lunch and come right in and get yourself set up.
Awesome.
So